Greetings, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome to today's edition of retfos, where I take old stories I've narrated and update into modern audio standards. This particular story is called The Odds, written by Tanner Bananen. As a census military statistician for the government of the Orion Federation, I've had the privilege of carefully curating some of the most expansive and comprehensive data in the galaxy. And for a logic-minded quacksar like me, it has, by and large, been an extraordinarily cathartic experience. This is because, with the sample size often approaching the trillions, the bell curves tend to emerge nearly everywhere one looks, be it in food production/consumption, sleep cycles, or unaugmented intelligence. I, for one, love bell curves. And with such a large assortment of member races, 726 to date, each with a vast repository of historical data, often 100 kilocycles or more, such trends even normalize nicely across species. A desert-dwelling mammalian packet gan may not have much in common with an amphibious tundra-dweller, such as the Ukatari, but in the context of better part of 1,000 other species, they simply occupy opposite extremes of the same curves. After all, every sapient race that survives to become spacefaring does so because it adheres to this set of rules. For example, such a race must have a biology and metabolism that effectively converts chemical potential energy into electric potential and kinetic energy. It must also possess intelligence capacity to construct rockets. It must also hold a sense of empathy and internal pacifism to keep from destroying itself in the process. To be inducted into the Federation and not outright quarantined, it must extend this empathy to other species. That is to say, a race must not be xenocidal in nature. For most of my 100-cycle tenure at the Census Ministry, I've dutifully applied the laws of statistical analysis to have been honed by myself and the quacksar predecessors for as long as we have been a part of the Federation. It is on this note that I wish to submit my resignation. 5 cycles ago, I noticed a blip in the census data on several bell curves. At first, I thought one of my colleagues had simply made a transcription error in his survey, that it could be rectified through external intervention. So I tracked him down and retranscribed the data myself. The blip grew. So I determined that the data collection methods must be flawed. I jumped out to the sector from which this tainted data originated. It was a collection of 9 colonized worlds with 5 more in the process of light terraformation, all under the local authority of a young species newly inducted into the Federation. They had discovered spaceflight only 200 cycles prior to this, with FTL coming 170 cycles later, and supplied census data of their own upon Federation request. These high primates called themselves human. Aha! I had mused. I reasoned that such a new and primitive race would likely fail to collect data to the precision standards of the Federation Census Ministry, introducing a systemic bias that could skew their contribution. I immediately volunteered to conduct a secondary census survey on their behalf in the hopes of moving the blip back towards the median using updated data and modernized methods. They accepted graciously, and I set off towards the nearest colony on an envoy of their best statisticians and data scientists who hoped to learn from my anecdotal experience with the Federation. However, when we finally finished the paperwork and boarded their vessel, something seemed amiss. One human, a female, single-handedly lifted double her weight in supplies and carted the parcel a quarter-kilometer from their command building to their launch pad. They had a gymnasium on their vessel, in which one human sprinted on a static conveyor belt for what should have been 6 or 7 kilometers in under half an hour. I watched in horror as 2 humans faced off in a battle of wits, constantly working to subvert the other by placing black and white stones on a board. They called this interpersonal war of strategy a game, a mental exercise that they claimed could be used to optimize their neural pathways, as if such a thing was simply a normal part of life. Another human played a one-player game known as the Rubik's Cube. For some reason, he insisted that it was more of a puzzle than a game. I'm still not entirely convinced the distinction is relevant, but I digress. Convinced that these humans were simply posturing and not representative of the whole, I opened a connection to the Human Provisional Government of Sol 3 and requested access to their internet, which they granted almost immediately. My sense of unease grew when I started watching videos of average people achieving the feats that I'd been on awe at. And to make matters worse, every 5 cycles, humans would send their best and brightest from all across the sector to a physical and mental sporting competition known as the Olympiad, named loosely after a place of myth that was home to the ancient culture's gods. I'd seen sporting events in the Federation before, but never had I encountered such incredible feats of strength, agility, and dexterity from any single species. Humans were literally a force to be reckoned with. That much was certain. But was it statistically significant? Perhaps their population had an abnormally large degree of variance, and could thus fit in nicely with the model. After using my non-invasive physical and mental evaluation tool given by the Federation, I had to concede that this was not the case. In all physical and metabolic metrics, their median outclassed that of the Federation by a whole 1 to 2 standard deviations. Sure, their distribution was just as wide, but even their bottom 5% could stand up against the bottom 60% of Federation citizens easily. Mentally, they were a bit closer across most metrics. Their median beat that of the Federation by just shy of a standard deviation, coming to par with even the Quaxar. But their distribution was very heavily skewed to the right, with their top 5% sitting at 2.5 standard deviations away, and their top 1% 1 deviation above that. Additionally, their mere presence rendered the Federation-wide curve and intuition and creativity slightly bimodal. Their population medium was indexed at 3 standard deviations above Federation medium in tight clusters with nearly no variance. I can only surmise that the species-wide intuition is the reason they managed to discover FTL so quickly after developing chemical rocketry, but that's something for the xenoneurologists to fawn over. As for the integrity of my data, it probably didn't help that a human generation is a mere 18 standard cycles, 30 solar years on average, and that on their 9 newly minted colony worlds, they already numbered somewhere low in the 100 billions. By comparison, the Quaxar only numbered 19 billion, even after 1,000 years of growth. No wonder such a physical and mentally proficient species could shift my painstakingly normalized distributions. They simply happened to be proficient in mating too, a fact that many xenophilic races would come to appreciate in the early years of their integration, if you receive my trajectory. But this is not why I am quitting. See, all of these variations are weird, but they are not entirely unexpected. Some are even fairly reasonable given their status as a race of omnivorous prey-turned-predator. These humans didn't descend to sapiens because they had a few million years of planetary domination to lazily work everything out. They ascended by sheer force of will, using their ingenuity and creativity to create tools that augmented their already formidable physical ability, leveraging their strengths to defeat predators and outclass them by several standard deviations. Sol 3 is a Deathworld, plain and simple, and these humans managed to claw their way to the top, dragging their existing predators kicking and screaming into inferiority and, in some cases, extinction. They are smart, brutal, and extraordinarily cunning because they had to be. In this context, their inherent aptitudes makes a great deal of sense, seeing as to how they fundamentally differ from almost every other Federation member race. No, I'm quitting because humanity goes a step further than that, into some wholly uncharted territory. In the 5 years since the human provisional government joined the Federation, tens of millions of humans have integrated all across Federation space, taking mostly civilian jobs as engineers or educators, but a few military ones too. This number exploded after the first Archahan invasion forced humanity to submit to the draft. 100 million humans served in thousands of campaigns all across the arm in that time, on tens of thousands of Federation warships. Oddly enough, many of them volunteered. Of course, the Census Ministry keeps hard at work even in wartime, collecting casualty lists and combat logs for analysis. One of the many metrics we maintain is a species-wide list of combat casualties with cause of death. Over the course of the war, 28,000 Federation ships were lost. Of those, only 3 were crewed by humans. Then in all 3 cases, all humans aboard died or left before the ship was destroyed. To reiterate, Not a single ship was lost with a live human on board. As for the ships that had humans aboard for the course of their entire war, vessels were 3,738% more likely to return home, 2,627% more likely to suffer zero casualties aboard for any reason, and 2,135% more likely to successfully incapacitate the enemy vessel in combat, despite being functionally identical to all other standard-class Federation warships. The last statistic is explainable by accounting for the incredible motor reflexes of human gunners and fighter pilots, but the former two seemed odd and interesting to me. Human-crewed ships made up less than 11% of the Federation war fleet, and yet the Darkonnen Imperial Guard specifically requested to surrender to a human fleet admiral, believing her to be the prophetic figure from the ancient culture. As an enemy shielded from harm by the gods, she was said to symbolize a shift in divine mandate away from the Darkonnen, to quote their fleet admiralty. Whenever we targeted her flagship with clear lines of sight, our autonomous weapons simply couldn't bring themselves to fire. They all malfunctioned, almost as though they turned off their own relays in protest. Their allies, our fundamentalist theocratic Grafton Dominion, referred to the humans as unkillable apes from hell. At the Just Tan hearings, where the Darkonnen alliance was formally dissolved and tried for war crimes under Federation law and annexed, 8 Dominion officers from ground campaigns of Yactus II became violently ill and vomited on their podiums when faced with a human lieutenant who had single-handedly disarmed their entire company. Allegedly, he ended up killing half of their stock troops with a single 30-round magazine in his rifle. His devilish smile jammed the divine light of our stellar lancers, tempting their purest crystal cores into the darkest depths of his heart. Lieutenant Daniels, who has since been promoted to major, said that he was just a grunt doing his part for the Marines. A quick scan of his biology confirmed that he was entirely within standard normal benchmarks in all tested parameters. In other words, he was quite unremarkable by human standards, and yet he faced certain doom and survived. From our side of the curtain, puzzling tales emerged of human survivability and skill far beyond their normal tolerances. Planetside, the Garuku field sergeant, who served as the Hamelakaton front, told stories of the human sniper that, in one shot, killed 6 Darkonnen soldiers, 2 officers, and a field commander, when his defective AP round deflected off the commander's hardened neural interface, fragmented into 8 pieces, and ejected directly into the skulls of the 8 surrounding infantrymen, from a distance of 5.621 kilometers. Lucky shot, said the entirely unfazed human sniper, despite having just smashed 3 Federation-wide records in a single pull of the trigger. A human infantryman stationed on Yarkalos 4 tried to shield his Federation comrades from a live pulse grenade by diving onto it. Somehow, the grenade self-disarmed. This was the only recorded time in combat that a Darkonnen grenade failed to detonate, despite more than 2 billion being used successfully throughout ground campaigns. On the low-gravity mineral world of Farish, a human commander managed to incapacitate an entire Dominion tank division by synchronizing dozens of anti-tank mines in a single blast, flipping the first column onto the second, which detonated into the third, which detonated into the fourth, and so on. It should be noted that prior to this unauthorized requisition of mines from Federation Garrison Squadron, he said, "I have an idea." Such self-detonation of Dominion tanks had never been observed in battle up to this point, so how the human figured the strategy would prove effective is unknown. In space, battle recordings and sensor data showed human-piloted ships completely evading otherwise fatal circumstances for no particular reason. In one case, it was a squadron of human/Federation bombers riding the shock runs of catastrophic graviton reactor failures from Darkonnen Imperial-class carriers, and emerging entirely unscathed. Sensor data showed nothing out of the ordinary, despite their proximity to gigaton detonations and extreme levels of gravitational flux. The specific bomber wing referred to themselves as the bell-bottoms. What significance this name holds is unknown. In the same battle, one Federation pilot watched 2 Dominion railgun rounds, each traveling at an appropriate fraction of flight speed, smack into each other less than a quarter kilometer in front of a human frigate. Somehow, the near-light-speed fragmentation dispersed in such a way that neither the ship nor the enormous escort of human fighters took any hull damage. In a different battle, a human destroyer dropped out of FTL and rematerialized in the side of another human destroyer. The combined vessels suffered no loss of functionality in combat. As far as our physicists knew, conjoined rematerialization was impossible. The Pauli exclusion principle would be breached, and atoms would rectify this by fusing together, generating radiation pressure and an explosion. Post-battle structure scans showed that precisely no heavy elements were formed, and that the bond between the two ships more resembled a seamless three-dimensional contact weld than a collision. The mechanism for this is as yet unknown, and further study is underway. These tales shook the scales and feathers of many a statistician in my office. So as the war drew to a close, I devised the survivability index, a species-wise metric that took into account his specific participation and ship damage data across the Federation and compiled it all into a single scalar between 0 and 10. I had high hopes. This statistic provided that most every instance of damage in interstellar space is random and that crews of vessels are largely mixed, should match evenly between species, regardless of localized fitness or intellect. The only way to score high is to be on a frontline ship that suffered absolutely no damage over the course of the war. This should account for humans being both skilled tacticians and engineers, because the darker hand invaders used luminal beam weaponry and relativistic kill missile rounds that cannot be dodged at close range, and engineers can only repair damage that has already occurred. Therefore, if there is any correlation, it must be incredible random luck alone, which tends to cancel itself out over time. Additionally, since our humans were disproportionately more likely per capita to volunteer in the frontline roles, I expected their score to be considerably lower than the rest of the Federation. The median for the Federation was 3.7356, with a relatively small standard deviation of 0.5828. Humanity scored a 9.94. They managed to land 10 entire standard deviations above the median on the statistics that is, by definition, completely random, with an existing and premeditated mathematical bias against them. I've hushed this data from going public or even getting archived for obvious reasons, the most important of which being that I find it unfitting to feed the human's ego with the notion that they are more likely gods, lest they start to actually believe it. Alas, that is the conclusion I and others have collectively and objectively reached. They are nothing like us, and somehow they haven't quite figured it out yet. To sum it up, humanity routinely demonstrates its ability to entirely defy logic, and in some cases basic physics. Being around them makes you 2 orders of magnitude more likely to survive the day, no matter the circumstances. They are smart, fast, courageous, strong, and enduring, yes, but they are also unbelievably and inexplicably lucky. That is ultimately why I'm leaving my post. I may have served well in the relative safety of a Federation stronghold in its jewel of the capital world, but if there is one thing I have learned throughout my encounters with the odd high apes from a Deathworld and galactic fringe, there is no place in the universe safer than on the bridge of a human ship. And that, High Chancellor, is precisely where I intend to go. Yours truly, and Kwashi Sakan Quaxar Statistical Combine. End of story. I'd greatly like to thank our Tier 5 channel members, Caspar Arnholtz, John Creighton, Manatharia, 050, Dragzoon WRE, and Elijah Silvercross. Thank you very much.